What if a queen spent 16 years in prison, put there by her own husband? What if a child bride, crowned Queen of England, was widowed at 9 years old and sent back to her home country in disgrace? What if a queen's love life was so complicated she was technically married to two men at once, creating a national scandal? The lives of the Plantagenet women were not simple fairy tales. They were complex stories of power, survival, and ambition, often lived in the shadow of the men they married. But their stories are not just footnotes in history books. They shaped the course of a dynasty. Number 20. Did a Tudor rose erase a Plantagenet queen? And Elizabeth of York was born a princess, the eldest daughter of King Edward IV. She was once promised to the Dauphin of France. Her two younger brothers disappeared in the Tower of London. Her uncle Richard III took the throne and declared her illegitimate. After Richard's death at the Battle of Bosworth Field, she married the victor Henry Tudor. Elizabeth of York's life was defined by the men around her. First, her father, King Edward IV, then her uncle, King Richard III, finally, her husband, King Henry VII. It is easy to see her as a pawn in their games, a piece to be moved on a chessboard to secure a claim or unite a kingdom. But that view misses the woman herself. She was not just a symbol, she was a person who navigated an incredibly dangerous world. When her father died in 1483, everything changed. Her world fell apart. Her brothers, Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, were taken to the Tower of London. They were never seen again. The man who put them there was her uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. He became King Richard III. Yeah, he also had Parliament pass an act, the Titulus Regis, which declared her father's marriage to her mother, Elizabeth Woodville, invalid. This made Elizabeth of York and her siblings illegitimate. In a single move, she went from being the king's eldest daughter to a bastard with no claim to the throne. She and her mother took sanctuary in Westminster Abbey. This was a common practice for those in danger. It offered religious protection from political enemies. They stayed there for nearly a year. It was a time of immense uncertainty. Her future was completely unknown, while in sanctuary a plot was hatched. Her mother, Elizabeth Woodville, allied with Margaret Beaufort, the mother of Henry Tudor. And Henry was the main Lancastrian claimant to the throne, living in exile. The plan was simple. Henry would invade England, defeat Richard III, and marry Elizabeth of York. This marriage would unite the warring houses of Lancaster and York. It would end the Wars of the Roses. The plan worked. Henry Tudor defeated and killed Richard III at Bosworth Field in 1485. He became King Henry II. But he did not marry Elizabeth immediately. He was clever. He first had to establish his own right to the throne. He had the Titulus Regius repealed, making Elizabeth legitimate again. His claim was based on his own victory in battle and his distant Lancastrian blood. He was crowned king in his own right in October 1485. Only then, in January 1486, did he marry Elizabeth. This was a clear political statement. He was king on his own terms, not because he married her. Their marriage created the Tudor rose, a symbol combining the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York. It was a powerful piece of propaganda. It signaled peace and unity. Elizabeth's role was to be the living embodiment of that unity. She was the Yorkist princess who willingly joined the new Tudor dynasty. She gave Henry the heirs he desperately needed. Her first child was Arthur, Prince of Wales. Her second son was the future Henry VIII. She also had two daughters who survived to adulthood, Margaret and Mary. Elizabeth was a popular queen. The people remembered her as the beautiful daughter of Edward IV. Her presence helped to legitimize her husband's rule, especially in the early years when his hold on power was shaky. There were several Yorkist plots against him, often involving pretenders claiming to be one of her lost brothers. But Elizabeth remained loyal to Henry. There is no evidence she ever supported these rebellions. Her loyalty was crucial. She had wavered, it could have given the plots a dangerous legitimacy. She seems to have had a genuinely affectionate relationship with her husband. Their surviving financial records show small personal gifts exchanged between them. He trusted her. When he was away, he He gave her significant responsibilities. She was not a political novice. She had grown up in the heart of the court. She understood how power worked. She managed her own large household and extensive estates with skill. She was a significant landowner and a source of patronage. Her court was a center of culture. She was a patron of the arts and music. She encouraged the new printing press, introduced by William Caxton. She was also known for her piety and her charity. She gave generously to religious houses and to the poor. Her life ended relatively young. She died in 1503 on her 37th birthday, following the birth of her last child, a daughter who also died. Henry VII was said to be devastated by her death. He never remarried. He became more withdrawn and suspicious in his final years. He spent lavishly on her funeral, a testament to his feelings for her. Elizabeth of York's legacy is often overshadowed by her larger-than-life husband and her even more famous son, Henry VIII. The Tudor dynasty she helped to found became one of the most famous in English history, but her own identity as a Plantagenet princess, the last of her line to be queen, is sometimes forgotten. She was the bridge between two eras. She was born a Plantagenet, but died a Tudor. Her blood ran through the veins of every subsequent Tudor monarch, and through them to the Stuarts and the rulers of England and Britain ever since. She was more than a symbol. She was a survivor. Number 19 was the Kingmaker's daughter, a pawn or a player. Anne Neville was the daughter of the most powerful man in England. She was married to the heir to the Lancastrian throne. After he was killed, she married the man who became the last Yorkist king. Her father was Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker. Her first husband was Edward of Westminster, Prince of Wales. Her second husband was King Richard III. She was Queen of England for just 2 years. Her life was a whirlwind of political maneuvering, largely directed by her father. The Earl of Warwick was the ultimate power broker during the Wars of the Roses. He first helped put his cousin, Edward IV, on the throne. He was the power behind the Yorkist king. Anne grew up at the center of this power. She and her older sister, Isabel, were the two greatest heiresses in the country. Their marriages were tools for their father's ambition. Warwick's relationship with King Edward IV eventually broke down. The king angered Warwick by secretly marrying Elizabeth Woodville, a commoner, when Warwick was trying to arrange a French royal match for him. The king also began to favor his wife's family, the Woodvilles, over the Nevilles. Warwick felt his influence slipping away. So he switched sides. This is where Anne's life took its first dramatic turn. Warwick fled to France and made an alliance with his former enemy, Margaret of Anjou, the exiled queen of the Lancastrian king Henry VI. To seal this new alliance, Anne Neville was betrothed to Margaret's son, Edward of Westminster, the Lancastrian Prince of Wales. She was just 14 years old. The marriage took place in France in late 1470. Suddenly, the daughter of the leading Yorkist was married to the Lancastrian heir. Warwick then invaded England and successfully restored Henry VI to the throne. Edward IV was forced into exile. For a brief period, it seemed Anne was destined to be the next Queen of England. She and her new husband, along with his mother Margaret of Anjou, prepared to return to England to join the restored king. But their triumph was short-lived. Edward IV returned from exile with an army. He met Warwick's forces at the Battle of Barnet in April 1471. Warwick was defeated and killed. Just a few weeks later, Edward IV faced the Lancastrian army, led by Margaret of Anjou and her son at the Battle of Tewkesbury. The Lancastrians were crushed. Anne's husband, Edward of Westminster, was killed either during or shortly after the battle. At the age of 14, Anne was a widow. She was also a prisoner. Her father was dead, her husband was dead, and her mother-in-law was captured. The Lancastrian cause was lost. Her future was once again uncertain. She was now a political prize. She was co-heiress to the vast Warwick estates, along with her sister Isabel. Isabel was married to George, Duke of Clarence, King Edward IV's younger brother. Clarence wanted the entire Warwick inheritance for himself. He tried to prevent Anne from remarrying. According to one story, he even had her hidden away, disguised as a kitchen maid in London, to keep her out of sight. But there was another man who wanted to marry her, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the king's youngest brother. Richard had spent part of his youth in Warwick's household and had known Anne since childhood. He found her, and against Clarence's wishes, he married her. The exact date is uncertain, but it was likely around 1472. She was about 16. This marriage gave Richard control of his share of the Warwick lands and made him one of the most powerful magnates in the north of England. For the next decade, Anne lived as the Duchess of Gloucester. She and Richard seem to have had a stable marriage. They had one son, Edward of Middleham, born around 1473. They spent most of their time in the north, where Richard held great power and was generally well regarded. Then, in 1483, King Edward IV died unexpectedly. This plunged the kingdom back into crisis. Edward's son and heir was the 12-year-old Edward V. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was named Lord Protector of the young king. But events moved quickly. Richard had the young king and his brother placed in the Tower of London. He had Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville declared invalid, making their children illegitimate. With the rightful heir sidelined, Richard took the throne for himself, becoming King Richard III. Anne Neville was crowned Queen of England alongside her husband in July 1483. After a life of turmoil, she had finally reached the highest position in the land, but her reign was short and marked by tragedy. The fate of her nephews, the princes in the Tower, remains one of history's great mysteries, and it cast a dark shadow over Richard's reign. Then, in 1484, Anne's only child, her son Edward of Middleham, Prince of Wales, died suddenly. He was about 10 years old. This was a devastating personal blow for Anne and Richard. It was also a political disaster. It left Richard without a clear heir, weakening his hold on the throne. Anne's own health began to fail after her son's death. She died in March 1485, possibly from tuberculosis. She was only 28 years old. There were rumors at the time that Richard had poisoned her so he could marry his niece, Elizabeth of York, to strengthen his position. Most historians today dismiss this as propaganda spread by his enemies. An eclipse of the sun on the day of her death was seen by some as a bad omen for the king. Just 5 months after Anne's death, Richard III was defeated and killed at the Battle of Bosworth Field by Henry Tudor. His death marked the end of the Plantagenet dynasty. Anne Neville's life shows the precarious position of even the most high-born women in medieval England. She was used as a political pawn by her father, her brother-in-law, and her husbands, yet she was not merely passive. She survived the fall of her father, the death of her first husband, and imprisonment. She navigated the treacherous court politics to become queen. Her story is a tragic one, defined by loss and the ambitions of the men around her. She was a queen, but she was never truly in control of her own destiny. Number 18. Could a commoner queen outwit a king? Elizabeth Woodville was the daughter of a mere knight. She was a widow with 2 sons. She secretly married the handsome young King of England, Edward IV. Her family rose to great power, causing resentment among the old nobility. She was accused of witchcraft. After her husband's death, her sons were declared illegitimate and disappeared. She lived to see her daughter become Queen of England. The story of Elizabeth Woodville is one of the most dramatic of the entire Plantagenet era. She was not a foreign princess chosen for a diplomatic alliance. She was an Englishwoman, and her marriage to the king was based on love, or at least infatuation. This was highly unusual and deeply shocking to the court. She was born around 1437. Her mother, Jacquetta of Luxembourg, was a high-ranking European noblewoman, the widow of the Duke of Bedford, brother to King Henry V. Her father, Sir Richard Woodville, was from a more modest gentry family. Their marriage was itself a scandal because they married without the king's permission. But Jacquetta's connections gave the family an entry into the royal court. Elizabeth's first husband was Sir John Grey, a Lancastrian knight. They had 2 sons, Thomas and Richard. So Sir John was killed fighting for the Lancastrian cause at the Second Battle of St. Albans in 1461. This left Elizabeth a widow in her mid-20s with her husband's lands confiscated by the New Yorkist regime of King Edward IV. According to the traditional story, Elizabeth waited by the side of a road under an oak tree, hoping to encounter the king and petition him for the return of her son's inheritance. The King Edward IV was known for his good looks and his eye for beautiful women. He was captivated by her. But when he tried to make her his mistress, she refused. She insisted on marriage. On May 1st, 1464, they were married in secret in a private chapel. The secret marriage was a political bombshell. At the time, the powerful Earl of Warwick was in France negotiating a marriage for Edward with a French princess. The revelation that Edward was already married was a huge embarrassment for Warwick and a major diplomatic insult to France. It was the first major crack in the relationship between the king and the kingmaker. When Elizabeth was presented at court as the new queen, the nobility was stunned. They saw her as a low-born upstart. Their resentment grew as Edward showered her large family with titles, lands, and advantageous marriages. Her father was made an earl. Her siblings married into the highest ranks of the nobility. The Woodvilles, as they became known, were seen as greedy and ambitious, pushing aside the established families who had fought to put Edward on the throne. Elizabeth was a capable and politically astute queen. She understood the importance of patronage and used her position to advance her family's interests. This was standard practice for a medieval queen, but the scale of the Woodvilles' rise and their relatively humble origins made it a source of constant friction. In 1469, the Earl of Warwick rebelled against Edward IV, partly due to his frustration with Woodville influence. Warwick briefly captured the king. During this time, Warwick supporters accused Elizabeth's mother, Jacquetta, of witchcraft. The charges were flimsy and politically motivated, an attempt to discredit the queen and her family. The charges were eventually dropped, but the accusation of sorcery would later be used against Elizabeth herself. Warwick was eventually defeated and Edward restored, but the kingdom remained unstable. When Edward IV died suddenly in 1483, Elizabeth's world collapsed. Her 12-year-old son became King Edward V. Her brother-in-law Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was appointed Lord Protector. Richard quickly moved to seize power. He arrested Elizabeth's brother, Anthony Woodville, and her son from her first marriage, Richard Grey. They were later executed. Fearing for her other children, Elizabeth fled into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey with her younger son, Richard, Duke of York, and her daughters. From sanctuary, she was locked in a power struggle with Richard of Gloucester. Richard pressured her to release her younger son into his care, promising he would join his brother, the young king, in the Tower of London to prepare for the coronation. She reluctantly agreed. The two boys were never seen outside the tower again. Richard then had a sermon preached at St. Paul's Cross claiming that Edward IV had been pre-contracted to marry another woman before he married Elizabeth. This meant his marriage to Elizabeth was invalid. The Act of Titulus Regis was passed, declaring their children illegitimate and clearing the way for Richard to take the throne as Richard III. The accusation of witchcraft was also revived, suggesting Elizabeth had used sorcery to entrap the king into marriage. Elizabeth remained in sanctuary for months. She was stripped of her title and her lands. She was now known as Dame Elizabeth Grey. But she did not give up. From inside Westminster Abbey, she conspired with Margaret Beaufort. They agreed that Margaret's son, Henry Tudor, should invade and marry Elizabeth's eldest daughter, also named Elizabeth. In 1484, she and her daughters left sanctuary after Richard III publicly swore an oath to protect them and provide for them. You know, it was a risky move, but she had few other options. She had to place her trust in the man who had overthrown her son and likely been responsible for his death. When Henry Tudor defeated Richard III in 1485, Elizabeth Woodville's fortunes were restored. Her daughter became Queen of England, married to Henry VII. She was given the title and honors of a Queen Dowager. For a time, she was a respected figure at the new Tudor court. Her final years are more mysterious. In 1487, she retired from court and went to live at Bermondsey Abbey. The reasons are unclear. Some historians think Henry VII forced her into retirement because he suspected her of involvement in the Yorkist plot of Lambert Simnel. Others suggest it was her own choice, a desire for a peaceful religious life after years of turmoil. She died at the Abbey in 1492. Elizabeth Woodville's life was a testament to her resilience. She was a woman who rose from the gentry to the throne, who built a powerful family dynasty, and who survived its complete destruction. She outwitted and outlasted her enemies, including Richard III. She may have lost her sons, but she lived to see her daughter crowned, ensuring her bloodline would continue on the throne of England. Number 17, what happens when a queen becomes a general? Margaret of Anjou arrived in England as a 15-year-old bride for King Henry VI. She was meant to bring peace between England and France. Instead, she became a fierce and determined leader of the Lancastrian cause in the Wars of the Roses. She raised armies. She led her forces in battle. Her enemies called her a she-wolf. She fought for her husband's crown and her son's inheritance for 3 decades. Margaret was the daughter of René of Anjou, a man with many titles but little real power or wealth. She was intelligent, proud, and strong-willed. She came to an England that was deeply divided and poorly governed. Her husband Henry VI was a pious and gentle man who suffered from periods of severe mental illness, which made him incapable of ruling. In the early years of their marriage, Margaret tried to play the traditional role of a queen. She was a patron of learning, co-founding Queen's College, Cambridge. But as the political situation worsened and the king's weakness became more apparent, she was drawn into the factional struggles of the court. She became the focal point for the party that opposed the powerful Richard, Duke of York. York had a strong claim to the throne and was seen by many as a better alternative to the weak King Henry. The birth of her son, Edward of Westminster, in 1453, should have strengthened her position, but it came at a disastrous time. The king had just descended into his first major period of mental breakdown. He was completely unresponsive and did not even acknowledge his own child. The Duke of York was made protector of the realm. Rumors circulated, fanned by York supporters, that the prince was not the king's son. This was a direct attack on Margaret's honor and her son's legitimacy. When the king recovered his senses, Margaret moved to reassert her power. She had York dismissed from the council. The tensions between the two factions, Lancastrian led by Margaret and Yorkist led by York, finally erupted into open warfare at the First Battle of St. Albans in 1455. The Yorkists won. The Wars of the Roses had begun. For the next 20 years, Margaret was the driving force of the Lancastrian war effort. While her husband was often a passive figurehead, captured or incapacitated, Margaret was relentless. She traveled across England and to Scotland and France, seeking allies, raising funds, and gathering armies. She was a brilliant propagandist and a tireless organizer. Her reputation for ruthlessness grew. After a Lancastrian victory at the Battle of Wakefield in 1460, where the Duke of York was killed, she allowed his head, and the heads of other Yorkist lords, to be displayed on the gates of the city of York, adorned with a paper crown. After another victory at the Second Battle of St. Albans in 1461, she was accused of allowing her northern army to plunder the towns and countryside. These actions earned her the hatred of her enemies, particularly in London, which shut its gates to her. This was a turning point. Her failure to take London allowed York's son, Edward, Earl of March, to enter the city and be proclaimed King Edward IV. He then crushed the main Lancastrian army at the Battle of Towton. Margaret and her son were forced to flee, and she spent the next few years in exile, first in Scotland and then in France, desperately trying to win support to restore her husband to the throne. She became a petitioner in the courts of Europe, a queen without a kingdom. She never gave up. Her determination was extraordinary. Her chance finally came in 1470. In a stunning reversal, the powerful Earl of Warwick, who had been the architect of Edward IV's victory, switched sides. He allied with Margaret. To seal the deal, Margaret's son, Edward of Westminster, was married to Warwick's daughter, Anne Neville. This unholy alliance of former enemies succeeded. Warwick invaded England and restored Henry VI to the throne. So Margaret and her son prepared to return to England in triumph, but their timing was terrible. They were delayed by bad weather. By the time they landed in England in April 1471, the situation had changed dramatically. Edward IV had returned from his own brief exile. He had already defeated and killed Warwick at the Battle of Barnet. Margaret, refusing to flee, decided to march with her army to join with Lancastrian forces in Wales. Edward IV intercepted them at Tewkesbury. The resulting battle was a complete disaster for the Lancastrians. Her army was destroyed. Her son Edward of Westminster, the 17-year-old Prince of Wales, and the future of the Lancastrian cause, was killed. Margaret herself was captured a few days after the battle. She was paraded through the streets of London as a prisoner. Her husband, Henry VI, who had been held in the Tower, was killed shortly after. Her cause was utterly lost. Her son was dead, her husband was dead, and she was a captive. She remained a prisoner in England for 4 years, held at Wallingford Castle, and later at the Tower of London. She was finally ransomed by King Louis XI of France in 1475. In exchange for her freedom, she had to formally renounce all her claims to the English throne. She returned to France, the country she had left as a teenage bride 30 years earlier. She lived the rest of her life in poverty and obscurity, dependent on the charity of others. She died in 1482 and was buried in Angers Cathedral. Margaret of Anjou was one of the most remarkable women of the Middle Ages. In an era when women were expected to be meek and submissive, she was a warrior. She was a political and military leader who commanded armies and dictated strategy. Her enemies vilified her, creating a caricature of the she-wolf of France that has persisted for centuries. But she was also a fiercely loyal wife and a devoted mother, fighting with every ounce of her strength for her family's rights. She lost everything, but she never stopped fighting. Number 16, can a queen have a secret life after the crown? Catherine of Valois was the daughter of a French king. She married the great English hero, King Henry V, and became Queen of England. And she gave birth to his heir, the future Henry VI. After Henry V's sudden death, the young Dowager Queen embarked on a secret relationship with a Welsh courtier. Their grandson would become King Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty. Catherine's early life was marked by the instability of the French court. Her father, King Charles VI of France, suffered from bouts of severe mental illness. Her mother, Isabeau of Bavaria, was a controversial figure. The country was torn apart by a civil war between the Armagnac and Burgundian factions. It was into this chaotic world that Henry V of England launched his invasion, seeking to claim the French throne for himself. Henry's stunning victory at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415 put him in a powerful negotiating position. The result was the Treaty of Troyes in 1420. Under the terms of the treaty, Henry V would marry Catherine of Valois. He would be recognized as the heir to the French throne. Catherine's own brother, the Dauphin Charles, was disinherited. The marriage was a political union designed to unite the crowns of England and France. Catherine and Henry were married in June 1420. By all accounts, it was a successful match. Henry seems to have been fond of his young, beautiful wife. She accompanied him on his campaigns in France. In 1421, she was crowned Queen of England at Westminster Abbey with great ceremony. Later that year, she gave birth to a son, also named Henry. But her time as Henry VI's queen was brief. In 1422, while campaigning in France, Henry V died of dysentery. He was only 35. Catherine was a widow at the age of 21. Her son was less than a year old. He was now King Henry VI of England, and by the terms of the treaty, King of France as well. As the Queen Dowager and mother of the infant king, Catherine held a position of honor, but she had very little real political power. The government was run by a council of regency dominated by the king's uncles, the Dukes of Bedford and Gloucester. And Catherine's primary role was to raise her son. She was a young, wealthy, and high-ranking widow. Her potential remarriage was a matter of great political concern to the council. They feared she might marry a powerful nobleman who could then try to dominate the young king. To prevent this, Parliament passed a statute in 1428 which placed severe restrictions on a queen dowager's right to remarry. It stated that if she married without the king's consent, her husband would forfeit all his lands and possessions. Since the king was only a child, this effectively meant she could not remarry without the approval of the Regency Council. It was in these circumstances that Catherine began a secret relationship. The man was Owen Tudor, a Welshman from a respectable but not noble family. He was a clerk of her household, a position of service. The exact nature of their first meeting and the start of their relationship is unknown. It was kept entirely secret from the public and the government. Whether they were ever legally married is a subject of historical debate. No record of a marriage has ever been found. It's possible they married in secret, which would have been invalid without the king's consent. It's also possible they simply lived together as husband and wife without a formal ceremony. Either way, it was a huge risk for both of them. For Catherine, it was a defiance of the council's authority. For Owen, it was an act that could have been seen as treason. Together, they had at least 4 children. The 2 most well-known were their sons, Edmund and Jasper. A third son, Owen, became a monk. They also had a daughter who died young. The children were born in secret away from the court. They were Tudors, a name that at the time meant very little. The secret could not be kept forever. In 1436, Catherine fell ill and retired to Bermondsey Abbey. It was around this time that her relationship with Owen Tudor seems to have been discovered by the Duke of Gloucester. Owen was arrested and imprisoned. Catherine died at the Abbey in January 1437. She was only 35. On her deathbed, she may have revealed the existence of her secret family. After her death, her sons Edmund and Jasper were taken into the care of the court. Their half-brother, King Henry VI, grew up to be a kind and generous man. When he came of age, he was good to his Tudor half-brothers. He brought them to court. He created Edmund Earl of Richmond and Jasper Earl of Pembroke. He also arranged a very prestigious marriage for Edmund to Lady Margaret Beaufort. She was a wealthy heiress with a distant, though debated, claim to the throne from the Lancastrian line of John of Gaunt. This act of kindness by Henry VI had consequences no one could have foreseen. Edmund Tudor and Margaret Beaufort had one son, born after Edmund's early death. That son was named Henry. He was Henry Tudor. Through his mother, he had a sliver of a Lancastrian claim. Through his father, he was the grandson of a French princess and Queen of England. Decades later, after the Wars of the Roses had decimated the direct lines of both Lancaster and York, this Henry Tudor would return from exile, defeat Richard III at Bosworth Field, and take the throne as King Henry VII. He founded the Tudor dynasty. Catherine of Valois' secret life had a profound impact on English history. Her quiet defiance of convention and her relationship with an obscure Welsh courtier created a new royal line. She was the grandmother of the first Tudor king and the great-grandmother of Henry VIII. Her story shows that even when constrained by politics and expectations, a queen could find a way to live a life and create a legacy on her own terms. Number 15, how does a child queen survive a coup? Isabella of Valois was the daughter of King Charles VI of France. She was betrothed to King Richard II of England when she was 6 years old. She was married and crowned queen at the age of 7. She was a widow at 10. Her husband was deposed and murdered. She spent years as a political pawn in the hands of the new regime. She refused to recognize the new king or marry his son. Isabella's marriage to Richard II in 1396 was a purely political arrangement. Richard was a 30-year-old widower. His first wife, the popular Anne of Bohemia, had died 2 years earlier. He was seeking a long-term truce with France to end the 100 Years' War. Marrying the French king's young daughter was the cornerstone of this policy. The age of the bride was not a major obstacle in medieval diplomacy. The marriage was a contract. The union would not be consummated until Isabella was of age, which was considered to be 12. When Richard met his child bride in France, he treated her with kindness and respect. He told her she would be happy in England and that he would be like a father to her until she was old enough to be his wife. She arrived in England to a grand reception. She was married to Richard at Calais and then crowned Queen of England at Westminster Abbey. She had her own household, and Richard seems to have been genuinely fond of her, visiting her often and treating her with affection. But she was a child in a foreign land, at the center of a court filled with political tension. Richard's rule was becoming increasingly unpopular with some of his powerful nobles. In 1399, when Isabella was 9 years old, the crisis came. While Richard was on a campaign in Ireland, his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, Duke of Hereford, whom Richard had exiled, returned to England. Bolingbroke initially claimed he only wanted to reclaim his inheritance, but he quickly gained support from disgruntled nobles. By the time Richard returned, it was too late. His support had collapsed. He was captured and forced to abdicate the throne. Henry Bolingbroke became King Henry IV. The young queen was now in a very dangerous position. She was the wife of the deposed king and the daughter of the King of France. She was isolated from her husband, who was imprisoned in Pontefract Castle. She was moved to the Bishop of Salisbury's palace at Sonning, essentially under house arrest. The new king, Henry IV, treated her well, but she was a valuable political asset. In early 1400, a rebellion broke out, led by earls who were still loyal to Richard. It was known as the Epiphany Rising. The plan was to assassinate Henry IV and restore Richard to the throne. The rebels hoped to use Isabella as a figurehead. They visited her at Sonning and told her that her husband had escaped and was waiting for her in London. For a brief time, she believed them and supported their cause. The rebellion was quickly crushed. It also sealed Richard's fate. He died in Pontefract Castle shortly afterward, likely murdered on Henry IV's orders to prevent any future plots. Isabella, at the age of 10, was now a queen dowager. Henry IV's plan was to keep her in England and marry her to his own son, the future Henry V. This would maintain the French alliance, and also give his son's future reign the legitimacy of being married to the previous king's widow. But Isabella refused. She was remarkably strong-willed for a child. She went into mourning for Richard and refused to accept that he was dead. She refused to acknowledge Henry IV as king. When Henry proposed the marriage to his son, Prince Hal, she flatly rejected the idea. She would not marry the son of the man who had overthrown her husband. Her father, the King of France, also demanded her return. The French were furious about Richard's deposition and death. They wanted the queen back, along with her substantial dowry. For over a year, diplomatic negotiations went back and forth. Henry IV was reluctant to let her go. He kept her in a state of limbo, hoping she would change her mind. Finally, in 1401, Henry agreed to send her back to France, though he refused to return her dowry. Isabella returned to her home country, a widow at the age of 12. She had survived the overthrow of her husband and had successfully resisted the pressure of a new king. Her story did not end there. She remained a key figure in the complex politics of the French court. In 1406, at the age of 16, she married her cousin Charles, Duke of Orleans. This was a love match, and by all accounts, they were a happy couple. Charles of Orleans was a gifted poet. But tragedy struck again. In 1409, Isabella died at the age of 19, shortly after giving birth to their daughter, Joan. Her life was short and filled with turmoil. She was a pawn in the great game between England and France. But she was not a passive one. As a child, she showed incredible courage and integrity, refusing to bend to the will of powerful men. She survived a coup and maintained her loyalty to her husband, a king she had known for only a few years. Her second husband, Charles of Orleans, would later be captured by the English at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. He spent the next 25 years as a prisoner in England, writing some of the most beautiful poetry of the late Middle Ages. The daughter he had with Isabella, Joan, went on to marry the Duke of Alençon, a prominent commander who fought alongside Joan of Arc. Number 14, why was a royal cousin's love life a national scandal? And Joan of Kent was known as the Fair Maid of Kent for her beauty. She was the granddaughter of King Edward I. She was the mother of King Richard II. She was also at the center of one of the most complex marital tangles in English royal history. She secretly married a knight. Then, while he was away, she married a great earl. The Pope had to intervene to decide who her real husband was. Joan was a Plantagenet by birth. Her father was Edmund of Woodstock, Earl of Kent, the youngest son of Edward I by his second wife, Margaret of France. This made her a first cousin to King Edward III. Her early life was traumatic. Her father was executed for treason in 1330 after being tricked into a plot against the young Edward III's regents. Joan and her family were placed under house arrest. When Edward III took power for himself, he reversed the charges against her father and took his cousin Joan into the royal household. And she grew up at court, part of the glittering circle around Edward III and Queen Philippa. She was beautiful and charming. In 1340, when she was about 12 years old, she entered into a clandestine marriage. This was a secret, private ceremony with a knight of her household named Thomas Holland. Such marriages, based on the consent of the two parties, were considered valid by the church at the time, even without witnesses or a priest, as long as vows were exchanged. Shortly after their secret marriage, Thomas Holland had to leave England to fight on the continent. While he was away, Joan's family, unaware of her existing marriage, arranged another match for her. This was a much more suitable marriage for a royal cousin. The groom was William Montagu's son and heir of the Earl of Salisbury. A public wedding ceremony was held in 1341. So Joan was now, in the eyes of the church, married to two men. She was living as the wife of William Montagu, the future Earl of Salisbury. Meanwhile, her first husband, Thomas Holland, returned from the wars to find his wife married to someone else. Holland did not give up. He appealed directly to the Pope in Avignon. He presented his case, arguing that he was Joan's true husband and that her marriage to Montagu was bigamous and invalid. The case was a huge scandal. It took years for the papal court to investigate and come to a decision. During this time, Joan continued to live with Montagu. Finally, in 1349, the Pope delivered his verdict. He ruled in favor of Thomas Holland. He declared that Joan's marriage to Holland was valid, and that her marriage to Montagu was null and void. Montagu was ordered to return Joan to her rightful husband. Joan and Thomas Holland were finally able to live together openly as husband and wife. They had five children together. Holland was created Earl of Kent in right of his wife. For a decade, they seem to have lived a relatively stable life. Then, in 1360, Thomas Holland died. Joan was a widow at the age of 32. She was also one of the wealthiest women in England. She was the Countess of Kent in her own right, and she held extensive lands. As a royal cousin and a great heiress, her hand in marriage was once again a valuable prize. This time, she made her own choice, and it was another shocking one. She chose to marry Edward of Woodstock, the Prince of Wales, known to history as the Black Prince. He was the eldest son of King Edward III and the heir to the throne. He was also her first cousin once removed. They had grown up together at court. Their marriage was controversial. Marrying a close relative required a papal dispensation. More importantly, Joan was a widow with a scandalous past. Some at court felt she was not a suitable bride for the heir to the throne. But the prince was determined, and his father, the king, eventually gave his consent. They were married in 361 at Windsor Castle. As Princess of Wales, Joan accompanied her husband to Aquitaine, the province in France, which he ruled. They held a magnificent court there. It was in Aquitaine that she gave birth to two sons. The first died in childhood. The second, born in 1367, was named Richard. The Black Prince's health was broken by his campaigns in France and Spain. He and Joan returned to England in 1371. The prince never fully recovered. He died in 1376, a year before his father, King Edward III. This meant that Joan's 10-year-old son, Richard, was now the heir to the throne. When Edward III died in 1377, he became King Richard II. And Joan, as the king's mother, became one of the most influential people in the kingdom. She was a respected figure who held great power behind the scenes during her son's minority. She was known for her ability to mediate disputes and calm tensions. During the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, she played a role in the negotiations. She died in 1385. Her son Richard II was said to be devastated by her death. Her life was anything but conventional. She defied her family to make a secret marriage. She was at the center of a papal court case that scandalized the nation. She then married the heir to the throne. She navigated the treacherous waters of court politics to become a powerful and respected queen mother. Joan of Kent, the fair maid, was a woman who consistently chose her own path, regardless of the consequences. Number 13 was kindness, a queen's greatest weapon. Philippa of Hainault was married to King Edward III for over 40 years. She gave birth to 12 children, including 5 sons who reached adulthood. Her descendants would fight for the throne in the Wars of the Roses. She was known for her compassion and kindness. She famously interceded to save the lives of the burghers of Calais, but she was also a shrewd businesswoman and a capable regent. Philippa came from Hainault, an area that is now part of Belgium and France. Her marriage to Edward was arranged when he was still a prince. It was a diplomatic alliance designed to provide English troops for an invasion of England to depose Edward's father, the unpopular Edward II. Philippa's father provided the troops. Edward and his mother, Isabella of France, launched their successful invasion. and Edward II was deposed, and the young Edward III became king. Philippa traveled to England and married Edward and York in 1328. She was about 14 years old. He was about 15. Unlike many royal marriages, theirs seems to have been a genuinely happy and successful one. They had a close and affectionate relationship that lasted their entire lives. In the early years of her reign, her main role was to produce heirs. She succeeded spectacularly. Her eldest son was Edward the Black Prince, born in 1330. Her other sons who survived were Lionel, Duke of Clarence John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster Edmund, Duke of York, and Thomas, Duke of Gloucester. The rival claims of the descendants of these sons would eventually lead to the dynastic conflict of the Wars of the Roses. Philippa was a popular queen. She was not seen as a greedy foreigner, unlike some previous queens. She had a gentle and kind nature that endeared her to the English people. Chroniclers of the time praised her compassion. The most famous story about her demonstrates this quality. In 1347, after a long siege, the town of Calais surrendered to Edward III. The king was furious at their long resistance and declared he would execute the town's leaders. He demanded that 6 of the leading citizens, or burghers, come to him bareheaded, with ropes around their necks, carrying the keys to the city. He intended to make an example of them. The 6 burghers presented themselves as ordered. The king commanded that they be beheaded. His own knights and nobles pleaded with him for mercy, but he refused. At that moment, Queen Philippa, who was heavily pregnant at the time, fell to her knees before her husband. In tears, she begged him to spare the men's lives for her sake and for the sake of their unborn child. Edward looked at his weeping wife and relented. He told her he could deny her nothing. He gave the prisoners to her, and she had them taken to her quarters, clothed, fed, and then set free. This story, whether completely accurate or not, became a central part of the legend of the good Queen Philippa. But she was more than just a kind and merciful queen. She was also a capable and intelligent partner to her husband. When Edward was away on campaign in France, which was often, Philippa sometimes acted as regent in his absence. In 1346, while Edward was fighting the campaign that would lead to the Battle of Crecy, King David II of Scotland invaded the north of England. Philippa took charge. She raised an army and rode north to confront the Scots. She gave a speech to her troops before the Battle of Neville's Cross, urging them to victory. The English won a decisive victory, and the Scottish king was captured. Philippa had secured the kingdom in her husband's absence. She was also a significant economic force. She had her own substantial income from her dower lands. She managed these estates astutely. She was also interested in commerce. She encouraged the wool trade, which was the backbone of the English economy. She brought weavers from her native Flanders to England to teach the English their advanced techniques. She also took an interest in coal mining on her lands in Tynedale. She was a patron of learning and the arts. The scholar Jean Froissart was her secretary for a time, and he wrote his famous chronicles at her behest. The Queen's College at Oxford was founded in her honor by one of her chaplains. Philippa died in 1369, probably from an illness related to dropsy. Her husband, the king, was with her at the end. He was heartbroken by her death. The chronicler Froissart wrote that their loving marriage was an example to all. Edward III never fully recovered from her loss. His final years were a sad decline, marked by senility and the influence of his unpopular mistress, Alice Perrers. Philippa of Hainault set a new standard for what a queen could be. She fulfilled her primary duty of providing heirs. She was a loyal and supportive wife to her husband. But she also carved out her own role as a compassionate intercessor, a capable regent, a patron of commerce, and a beloved figure to the English people. Her legacy was not just the children she bore, but the example she set of a successful and popular queen consort. Number 12. Did a she-wolf save or destroy her kingdom? Isabella of France was the daughter of a French king. She was the wife of an English king, Edward II. She was the mother of another, Edward III. She led an invasion of England, overthrew her own husband, and ruled the country as regent for her young son. She was later vilified as the she-wolf of France, a cruel adulteress who had her husband murdered. But the real story is far more complex. Isabella was married to Edward II in 1308. She was about 12 years old. He was 23. The marriage was intended to smooth over the difficult relationship between England and France. Isabella was beautiful and intelligent. Edward was handsome, but he was a disastrous king. He was not interested in the traditional noble pursuits of warfare and tournaments. He preferred commoners' activities like swimming and thatching. More damagingly, he showed overwhelming favoritism towards a succession of male companions. The first of these was Piers Gaveston. Edward showered Gaveston with titles, lands, and power, alienating the powerful English barons. Isabella was publicly humiliated by her husband's preference for Gaveston. At her own coronation feast, Edward spent more time with Gaveston than with her. The barons eventually had Gaveston captured and executed. Isabella initially tried to be a loyal wife and a peacemaker. She supported her husband. She bore him 4 children, including the future Edward III. For years, she tried to mediate between the king and his rebellious barons. She undertook important diplomatic missions to France on her husband's behalf. She was a skilled and respected diplomat. But Edward's next favorite, Hugh Despenser the Younger, was even more disastrous than Gaveston. Despenser and his father were greedy and ambitious. They accumulated vast amounts of land and wealth, often by bullying and cheating other nobles. They came to dominate the king completely. They also seem to have deliberately isolated the queen. They reduced her household, took away her lands, and even removed her children from her care. Isabella found herself a virtual prisoner, powerless and disrespected. The breaking point came in 1325. A dispute had arisen with France over the English-held territory of Gascony. Isabella was sent to France to negotiate a treaty with her brother, King Charles IV. This was her opportunity. Once in France, she refused to come back. She publicly denounced Hugh Despenser and said she would not return to England until he was removed from power. She had found a powerful ally in France, Roger Mortimer, an English baron who had been imprisoned by Edward and the Despensers, but had escaped from the Tower of London. He was one of their bitterest enemies. He and Isabella became lovers. Together, they began to plot an invasion of England. They gathered a small army of mercenaries. They also arranged a betrothal between Isabella's son, the young Prince Edward, and the daughter of the Count of Hainault, in exchange for more troops. In September 1326, Isabella and Mortimer landed in England with their small force. Their invasion was astonishingly successful. The regime of Edward II and the Despensers was so hated that the country rose up to support Isabella. Nobles and commoners flocked to her banner. The city of London welcomed her. The king and the Despensers were forced to flee. They were soon captured. The Despensers, father and son, were brutally executed. Edward II was forced to abdicate the throne in favor of his 14-year-old son, who became King Edward III. Since the new king was a minor, a regency was established. The real power lay with Isabella and her lover, Roger Mortimer. For the next 3 years, they ruled England. Mortimer made himself Earl of March and took vast estates for himself. He became as greedy and arrogant as the Despensers had been. The new regime quickly became as unpopular as the old one. The fate of the deposed Edward II is a dark and controversial story. He was held prisoner in Berkeley Castle. In September 1327, it was announced that he had died. The official cause was natural causes, but few believed it. The common belief then, and for centuries after, was that he had been murdered on the orders of Isabella and Mortimer. The gruesome, and likely untrue, story of how he was killed became a notorious part of English history. Isabella and Mortimer's rule did not last. In 1330, the young King Edward III, now 18, decided to seize power for himself. He led a small group of loyal companions in a surprise raid on Nottingham Castle, where his mother and Mortimer were staying. Mortimer was captured. He was declared a traitor and executed. Isabella's life was spared. She was not punished, but her political career was over. She was placed under a form of house arrest for a couple of years, but her son, the king, did not treat her harshly. He soon restored her freedom and her income. She lived for another 28 years in comfortable retirement. She was a wealthy dowager who managed her estates, enjoyed hunting and the arts, and was a frequent visitor to her son's court. She appears to have had a good relationship with him in her later years. She died in 1358. Isabella's legacy is a complicated one. Was she a wronged wife who acted to save the kingdom from a disastrous king and his corrupt favorites? Or was she a treacherous adulteress who overthrew her husband for her own ambition and power? The truth is likely somewhere in between. She was a highly capable woman who was pushed to extremes by an impossible situation. She took a huge gamble and won. For a time, she was the most powerful person in England. Her story is a stark reminder of the brutal, high-stakes politics of the medieval world and the difficult choices a queen had to make to survive. Her number 11 was Edward I's perfect queen, actually a ruthless businesswoman. Eleanor of Castile was the first wife of King Edward I. She was his devoted companion for 36 years. She accompanied him on crusade. She bore him at least 14 children. When she died, her heartbroken husband erected the famous Eleanor Crosses, a series of 12 monumental crosses marking the route of her funeral procession from Lincoln to London. She is remembered as the model of a loyal and beloved medieval queen. But there is another side to her story. She was also a highly active and often ruthless businesswoman and property magnate. Eleanor was a princess of Castile, a powerful kingdom in what is now Spain. Her marriage to the future Edward I in 1254 was a political match designed to settle a dispute over the territory of Gascony. She was about 13, he was 15. Their marriage started out as a formality, but it grew into a deep and loving partnership. Unlike many royal wives, Eleanor was not content to stay in the background. She was highly intelligent and politically astute. She was her husband's closest confidante and advisor. Edward trusted her completely. She traveled with him everywhere, including his long and dangerous crusade to the Holy Land in 1270. It was there, in Acre, that Edward was wounded in an assassination attempt, and later romanticized story claimed that Eleanor saved his life by sucking the poison from the wound. While this is probably not true, it reflects her reputation for devotion. When they returned to England in 1274 to be crowned king and queen, Eleanor began to build her own power base. Her primary method was through land. She became one of the biggest landowners in England, second only to the king himself. She acquired land in several ways. She bought it. She was given it by the king, but she also acquired it through money lending. This is the less well-known side of Queen Eleanor. She operated a significant financial enterprise. She lent large sums of money, particularly to nobles and knights who were in financial difficulty. She often lent this money to Christians, which was unusual as the church technically forbade usury lending money at interest for Christians. This role was more typically filled by Jewish moneylenders. When her debtors could not repay their loans, she would often take their lands as payment. This led to a great deal of resentment. Many of the chroniclers of the time, who were mostly monks, criticized her for her greed and her sharp business practices. They accused her of avarice and of ruthlessly accumulating estates, driving knights and barons into poverty. The Archbishop of Canterbury, John Peckham, even wrote to her directly, warning her that her activities were causing a public scandal. He urged her to act with more moderation. It is important to see her actions in context. A queen was expected to have her own income to support her large household. Acquiring land was the primary way to secure that income. Eleanor was simply much better and more aggressive at it than previous queens. She was also acting as an agent of the crown. By acquiring lands from indebted nobles, she was concentrating more power and wealth in the hands of the royal family. This was part of Edward I's wider policy of strengthening royal authority. She was also a major patron of architecture and the arts. She had a passion for design and for books. She had her own scriptorium where manuscripts were copied and illuminated. She loved gardening and introduced new plants and garden designs to England. She was responsible for major renovations at many of the royal castles and palaces. Her Spanish background influenced the design of some of these projects, bringing new styles to England. Her children were her other major focus. She had a large family, though many of her children died young, which was common at the time. Only one of her sons, the future Edward II, survived to adulthood. She was a devoted mother, and her household accounts show her deep involvement in her children's upbringing. She died in 1290 near Lincoln while traveling north to meet the king. Edward was utterly devastated. His grief was profound and very public. He ordered the building of the Eleanor Crosses. These were elaborate and expensive stone monuments, each placed at one of the overnight stopping places of her funeral procession. 3 of them still survive today. They were a testament to his love, but also a powerful statement of royal majesty and grief. He also established numerous religious foundations to pray for her soul. Eleanor of Castile was a formidable woman. She was not just a passive, beautiful queen. She was an active political player, a successful businesswoman, and a key partner in her husband's rule. The traditional image of the devoted wife immortalized in stone by a grieving king is true. But so is the image of the hard-headed and sometimes unpopular property magnate. She was a complex and powerful figure who redefined the role of a queen consort in England. Number 10. Could a queen's family ruin a country? Eleanor of Provence came to England in 1236 to marry King Henry III. She was just 12 or 13 years old. She was beautiful, intelligent, and cultured, but she also brought with her a large number of foreign relatives. The king's favoritism towards these Savoyards, as they were known, caused widespread resentment among the English barons and was a major cause of the political crisis that led to a civil war. Eleanor was from Provence in the south of France. She was one of 4 famous sisters, all of whom married kings. Her older sister Marguerite married King Louis the Next of France. Her younger sisters Sanchia and Beatrice married the King of Germany and the King of Sicily, respectively. They were a remarkable family, raised in a court known for its poetry and culture. Her marriage to Henry III of England seems to have been a happy one. Henry was a devoted husband. He was a great patron of the arts and architecture, and he shared Eleanor's refined tastes. They had a long marriage and 5 children, including the future Edward I. The problem was not Eleanor herself, but the family she brought with her. When she came to England, she was accompanied by several of her uncles from Savoy. The most prominent were William, Peter, and Boniface of Savoy. Henry III welcomed them warmly. He was a generous and open-handed king, and he showered his new in-laws with titles, offices, and wealth. William of Savoy became one of the king's chief advisors. Peter of Savoy was granted the huge honor of Richmond and built the Savoy Palace in London. Boniface of Savoy, despite having no real religious qualifications, was made Archbishop of Canterbury, the most important religious office in the kingdom. This caused immense anger among the English nobility. They felt that these foreign favorites were taking the jobs, lands, and influence that should have gone to them. The Savoyards were seen as greedy outsiders who were draining the royal treasury and giving the king bad advice. This was part of a larger pattern of Henry's favoritism. He also heavily favored his own half-siblings, the Lucinians, from his mother's second marriage. The English court felt it was being overrun by foreigners. Eleanor supported her relatives. She was fiercely loyal to her family and used her influence as queen to promote their interests. This made her deeply unpopular. The chronicler Matthew Paris, who is one of our main sources for this period, was highly critical of her. He portrayed her as greedy and manipulative, constantly pressuring the king to give more to her Savoyard kin. Her unpopularity extended to the ordinary people of London. The Londoners resented the taxes levied by the king, which they believed were being wasted on foreigners. On one occasion, in 1263, Eleanor was sailing down the River Thames in her barge when she was attacked by an angry mob on London Bridge. They threw stones, mud, and rotten vegetables at her and shouted insults, forcing her to retreat to the safety of the Tower of London. The growing discontent with the king's rule and the influence of his foreign favorites came to a head in 1258. A group of powerful barons, led by Simon de Montfort, who was, ironically, a Frenchman himself, confronted the king. They forced him to agree to a program of reform known as the Provisions of Oxford. This established a council of 15 barons to advise the king and oversee the government. It was a radical attempt to limit royal power. All foreign-born officials were to be dismissed. Eleanor was fiercely opposed to the provisions. She saw them as an attack on her husband's authority and her family's position. She worked tirelessly to undermine the baronial council. She tried to raise money and support from her relatives on the continent. She was a staunch royalist and refused to compromise. Her refusal to accept the new order was a major factor in the breakdown of the agreement and the slide into civil war known as the Second Barons' War. During the war, Eleanor went to France to gather support for her husband's cause. She assembled a mercenary army intending to invade England to rescue him after he was captured by de Montfort at the Battle of Lewes in 1264. The invasion never happened, but her son, Prince Edward, escaped from captivity and led the royalist forces to victory at the Battle of Evesham in 1265. Simon de Montfort was killed, and Henry III was restored to the throne. After the war, Eleanor took a firm line. She wanted the rebel barons to be harshly punished and their lands confiscated. She used her position to acquire many of these confiscated estates for herself and her supporters. In her later years, after her husband's death and her son Edward I's accession, she became a more respected figure. She was a powerful and wealthy queen dowager. She eventually retired to a convent at Amesbury, as many royal widows did. But she did not cut herself off from the world. She continued to manage her vast estates and correspond with her son, the king. She died in 1291. Eleanor of Provence was a strong and determined queen. Her loyalty to her family and her husband was absolute. But this loyalty and the unpopularity of this void relative she championed helped to plunge England into a constitutional crisis and a civil war. She was a woman of culture and refinement, but also a tough and uncompromising political operator. Number 9, what makes a queen abandon? Her children for a lost love. Isabella of Angoulême was a celebrated beauty in her youth. She was betrothed to a powerful French nobleman. But King John of England saw her, and he had to have her. He broke off his own engagement and married her instead. She was about 12 years old. He was 33. She was a Queen of England and mother to the next king, Henry III. But after John's death, she abandoned her young children in England, returned to France, and married the man she had been betrothed to all those years before. Isabella was the only child and heiress of Aymer, Count of Angoulême, a strategically important territory in western France. In 1200, she was betrothed to Hugh de Lusignan, a member of a powerful and ambitious family in the region. This alliance was a threat to King John of England, who held the vast Duchy of Aquitaine. To break up this alliance, John took a drastic step. He visited Angoulême, met Isabella, and decided to marry her himself. He was already engaged to another woman, but he had his first marriage annulled. In August 1200, he married Isabella. She was crowned Queen of England in Westminster Abbey a few months later. Her marriage to John was not a happy one. The king was a difficult and cruel man. He was notoriously suspicious and unfaithful. He was also much older than her. Their relationship seems to have been strained. John was said to be infatuated with his beautiful young wife, but he also kept her under close watch. The marriage had immediate and disastrous political consequences. The Lusignan family, whom Isabella had jilted, were furious. They appealed to their overlord, King Philip II of France. Philip, who was John's great rival, was happy to use this as a pretext to cause trouble. He summoned John to his court in Paris to answer the Lusignans' complaints. When John refused to appear, Philip declared all of John's lands in France to be forfeit. This was the legal justification for the French invasion and conquest of Normandy and other English-held territories. In a very real sense, King John's impulsive marriage to Isabella of Angoulême led directly to the loss of a large part of the Angevin Empire. Despite their difficult relationship, Isabella fulfilled her primary duty as queen. She gave John 5 children, 2 sons and 3 daughters. Her eldest son, Henry, born in 1207, would succeed his father as King Henry III, Her second son, Richard, became the Earl of Cornwall and one of the wealthiest men in Europe. Her eldest daughter, Joan, married the King of Scotland. When King John died in 1216, in the midst of a civil war against his rebellious barons, Isabella's son, Henry, was only 9 years old. Isabella was a queen dowager in a foreign country with a child on the throne. She was about 28 years old. She stayed in England for the first year of her son's reign, but she had little power. The government was run by a regency council led by the great William Marshal. Isabella's position was uncertain. She was young, and her remarriage would be a matter of political importance. In 1217, she decided to return to France. She said she was going to her home county of Angoulême, which she had inherited after her father's death. She left all 5 of her young children, including the king, behind in England. Once back in France, she took control of her inheritance. And then she made a stunning decision. In 1220, she married Hugh de Lusignan, the man she had been engaged to marry 20 years earlier before King John had intervened. It is one of the great romantic twists of the medieval period. She returned to her first love. But it was also a politically calculated move. The Lusignans were a powerful family. By marrying Hugh, Isabella was securing her own position and the defense of her county. She was now a powerful countess in her own right, ruler of Angoulême and partner to the powerful Lord of Lusignan. And together, she and Hugh de Lusignan had 9 more children. These were the half-siblings of King Henry III of England. As these Lusignan children grew up, many of them decided to seek their fortunes in England at the court of their royal half-brother. Henry III was a generous man, and he welcomed his Lusignan half-siblings. He gave them land, titles, and influential positions. Just like Eleanor of Provence's Savoyard relatives, the Lusignans became a powerful and resented foreign faction at the English court. Their arrogance and the king's favoritism towards them was a major source of the political tension that led to the Barons' War. So Isabella, by her second marriage, created a problem that would plague her son's reign. Isabella and her husband Hugh were ambitious. They often rebelled against the authority of the French king. In 1241, they led a major revolt against King Louis IX of France. The revolt failed. Isabella was humiliated. According to one story, she was so enraged by the defeat that she tried to have King Louis poisoned. When the plot was discovered, she fled to Fontevraud Abbey, the traditional burial place of the Plantagenet kings. She remained at Fontevraud for the rest of her life. She died there in 1246. At her own request, she was initially buried in the common churchyard as an act of penance for her sins. Years later, her son, King Henry III of England, visited the abbey and was shocked to find his mother's grave in such a humble spot. He ordered her to be reburied in the royal crypt next to King Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. Isabella of Angoulême was a controversial figure. Was she a victim of King John's lust, who finally found happiness with her first love? Or was she a selfish and ambitious woman who abandoned her children to pursue her own interests in France? Her life was certainly extraordinary. She was a queen who turned her back on her kingdom, a mother who left her children, and a countess who defied 2 kings. Number 8, how can you be Queen of England without ever setting foot there? Berengaria of Navarre was the wife of King Richard I, the Lionheart. She was Queen of England for 8 years. But she never once visited the country during her husband's reign. She is the only English queen never to have set foot on English soil while she was queen consort. Her marriage was a long-distance one. Her husband was one of England's most famous kings, but she remains one of its most obscure queens. Berengaria was the daughter of the King of Navarre, a small kingdom in the Pyrenees Mountains between France and Spain. The marriage to Richard was a political arrangement orchestrated by Richard's formidable mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Richard had been betrothed for many years to Alice, the sister of King Philip II of France, but he had consistently delayed the marriage. He claimed that Alice had been his own father's mistress. He needed another bride, and Berengaria was a suitable choice. The alliance with Navarre would help to protect the southern border of his domains in Aquitaine. Eleanor of Aquitaine, then in her late 60s, traveled all the way from France to Navarre to fetch her son's bride. She then escorted Berengaria across Italy. They were heading for Sicily, where Richard was wintering on his way to the Holy Land on the Third Crusade. They arrived in Sicily in 1191. Richard was there with the French king Philip II. Because it was Lent, the marriage could not take place immediately. Richard was also still technically betrothed to Alice, and Philip had to be persuaded to release him from the contract. Richard then set sail for the Holy Land. He sent Berengaria and his own sister Joan, the widowed Queen of Sicily, ahead on a separate ship. Their ship was caught in a storm and shipwrecked on the coast of Cyprus. The self-proclaimed Emperor of Cyprus, Isaac Comnenus, took them prisoner and treated them badly. When Richard heard the news, he was enraged. He landed his army on Cyprus, conquered the entire island in a matter of weeks, and deposed Isaac. He then rescued his bride and his sister. On May 12, 1191, Richard the Lionheart and Berengaria of Navarre were married in the Chapel of St. George in Limassol, Cyprus. On the same day, she was crowned Queen of England and Queen of Cyprus by the Bishop of Evro. It was a grand ceremony in the middle of a crusade. Berengaria accompanied Richard to the Holy Land. She lived in Acre while he was on campaign. This was a highly unusual situation for a medieval queen. She was in a war zone thousands of miles from her home and from the kingdom she was now queen of. Their marriage does not appear to have been a close one. They had no children. Richard was a soldier, completely dedicated to the crusade. He spent little time with his wife. He was also rumored to have little interest in women. Some modern historians suggest he may have been homosexual, though the evidence is inconclusive. What is clear is that he and Berengaria did not have a conventional marital relationship. When Richard left the Holy Land in 1192 to return to Europe, they traveled separately. This time Richard was the one who was shipwrecked. He was captured in Austria and handed over to the Holy Roman Emperor, who held him for a huge ransom. During the years Richard was a captive, Berengaria lived in Poitou, in Richard's French territories. She helped, along with her mother-in-law Eleanor of Aquitaine, in the massive effort to raise the money for his ransom. After Richard was finally released in 1194, he returned to England for only a few months. Berengaria did not join him. He then crossed back to France to fight a long war against King Philip to reclaim the territories he had lost. Berengaria remained in Poitou. For the last 5 years of Richard's life and reign, they lived apart and probably never saw each other again. There is even a story that the Pope had to order Richard to reconcile with his wife and treat her properly. When Richard was killed during a siege in 1199, Berengaria was a widow. She had been Queen of England for 8 years, but had never been to the country. Her brother-in-law, King John, who succeeded Richard, treated her badly. Richard had promised Berengaria a substantial dower income from lands in his French territories. John refused to pay her what she was owed. For years, Berengaria had to fight to get her money. She appealed to the Pope, who excommunicated John several times over the issue, with little effect. After the French conquered Normandy and Poitou, her dower lands were lost. She was eventually given lands in Maine and the city of Le Mans by the French king. She settled in Le Mans and became known for her piety and her charitable works. She founded a Cistercian abbey there. She lived for another 30 years after Richard's death, a long and lonely widowhood. She did finally visit England once, long after she was queen, probably to see her sister-in-law. She died around 1230 and was buried in the abbey she had founded at Le Mans. Her tomb was later moved to the city's cathedral. Berengaria's story is a sad one. She was a queen in name, but she never had a kingdom or a real husband. She was a pawn in a political game, married to a man who was more interested in war and glory than in his wife. She spent her life on the margins of history, a footnote to the legend of the Lionheart. She was the queen who never came home. Number 7, could one woman rule 2 kingdoms and defy 2 kings? A queen of England spent 16 years as a prisoner. Her guard was her own husband, King Henry II. Before she was Queen of England, she was Queen of France. She went on a crusade. She was the mother of 2 English kings, Richard the Lionheart and King John. She was Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful and extraordinary women in European history. Eleanor was not born to be a mere consort. She was born to rule in 1137. When she was about 15, her father, the Duke of Aquitaine, died. He was the ruler of a vast and wealthy territory that stretched across southwestern France. It was larger and richer than the personal lands of the King of France. As his eldest child, Eleanor inherited it all. She became the Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right. She was the most eligible heiress in Europe. Her father's will stipulated that she should marry the heir to the French throne. Just a few weeks after her father's death, she was married to Prince Louis, who soon became King Louis VII of France. Suddenly, the teenage Duchess of Aquitaine was also the Queen of France. Their marriage was a difficult one. Eleanor was high-spirited, intelligent, and worldly. Louis was pious, monkish, and serious. The northern French court was grim and formal, very different from the vibrant, cultured court of Aquitaine, where she had grown up. In 1147, Eleanor insisted on accompanying her husband on the Second Crusade. This was unheard of for a queen. She traveled to the Holy Land with her own contingent of vassals from Aquitaine. The crusade was a military disaster. During the campaign, there were rumors of a rift between Eleanor and Louis. It was said she had become too close to her uncle, Raymond of Antioch. Some even accused her of an affair. The marriage produced 2 daughters, but no sons. By 1152, after 15 years of marriage, it was clear the relationship had broken down. They had the marriage annulled on the grounds of consanguinity. They were too closely related. Eleanor was free. And more importantly, she got her Duchy of Aquitaine back. She was once again the most powerful single woman in Europe. She did not remain single for long. Just 8 weeks after her marriage to the King of France was annulled, she made a brilliant and daring match. She married Henry Plantagenet, the Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou. He was 11 years younger than her. He was ambitious, energetic, and a formidable soldier. 2 years later, in 1154, he inherited the throne of England and became King Henry II. Eleanor was now Queen of England. Her new husband's territories, combined with her own vast Duchy of Aquitaine, created a massive collection of lands known as the Angevin Empire. It stretched from the borders of Scotland to the Pyrenees. For the first decade of their marriage, Eleanor and Henry worked as partners. She was actively involved in the government of the empire, often ruling in Henry's name when he was away. She bore him 8 children, including 5 sons. 4 of those sons would survive to adulthood: Henry the young king, Richard, Geoffrey, and John. But their relationship, which had started with such passion, began to sour. Henry was a relentless womanizer. His most famous affair was with Rosamund Clifford. He also tried to control Eleanor's Duchy of Aquitaine, treating it as his own, which she resented. He was a domineering and authoritarian ruler, and he treated his own family the same way. By the late 1160s, Eleanor had had enough. She left the English court and returned to Aquitaine. She established her own magnificent court at Poitiers. This became a famous center of chivalry and courtly love. In 1173, the situation exploded. Eleanor and her 3 eldest sons, Henry the young king, Richard, and Geoffrey, launched a great rebellion against Henry II. They were tired of their father's refusal to grant them any real power or territory. Eleanor was the driving force behind the revolt. The Great Revolt of 1173-74 was a massive, Europe-wide conflict, but Henry II was a brilliant military commander. He defeated his sons one by one, and he captured his wife. Eleanor was taken back to England as a prisoner. For the next 16 years, she was held under house arrest in various castles, mainly at Salisbury. She was moved around, never allowed to stay in one place for too long. She was Queen of England, but she was a prisoner of the king. She was only released after Henry II's death in 1189. Her favorite son, Richard the Lionheart, became king. Richard immediately freed his mother. Eleanor, now in her late 60s, entered the most powerful phase of her life. While Richard was away on the Third Crusade, and later, while he was a prisoner in Germany, Eleanor effectively ruled the Angevin Empire. She was the regent. She governed England, raised a huge ransom for Richard, and suppressed the rebellions of her youngest son, John. She was a skilled and respected ruler. After Richard's death in 1199, she supported John's claim to the throne against that of her grandson, Arthur of Brittany. She continued to be a major political force well into her 70s. In 1200, when she was nearly 80, she traveled across the Pyrenees to Castile to select one of her granddaughters to marry the heir to the French throne. She finally retired to Fontevraud Abbey, where she died in 1204. She was about 82 years old, an astonishing age for the time. She had outlived all but 2 of her 10 children. Eleanor of Aquitaine's life was epic in scale. She was a duchess in her own right, queen of 2 countries, a crusader, a rebel, a prisoner, and a regent. She defied the conventions of her time and wielded more power than almost any other woman of the Middle Ages. Number 6. What does it mean to be a lady of the English but never a queen? The Empress Matilda was the daughter of a king, the mother of a king, and the grandmother of 2 more. She was named as heir to the throne of England by her father, King Henry I. The barons of England swore an oath to support her, yet she was never crowned. She fought a long and bitter civil war for her inheritance, a period known as the Anarchy. She was declared Lady of the English, but she never held the title of Queen. Matilda had an impressive upbringing. She was the only surviving legitimate child of Henry I of England. As a child, she was a valuable diplomatic asset. In 1114, at the age of 12, she was married to the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry V century. She moved to Germany and was crowned empress. She was an intelligent and capable young woman, and she learned a great deal about government during her time as empress. In 1125, her husband, the emperor, died. They had no children. Matilda, now a 23-year-old widow, returned to her father's court in Normandy. Her life had already been more eventful than that of most medieval princesses, but a family tragedy had changed everything. In 1120, her younger brother, William Adelin, the only legitimate son and heir of Henry I, had drowned in the sinking of the White Ship. This created a succession crisis. For the first time since the Norman conquest, there was no clear male heir to the English throne. King Henry decided to do something unprecedented. He named his daughter Matilda as his heir. In 1127, he made all the major barons of England and Normandy swear a solemn oath to accept Matilda as their future ruler after his death. This was a radical move. There was no established precedent for a woman to rule England in her own right. To strengthen her position, Henry arranged a second marriage for her. Her new husband was Geoffrey Plantagenet, the Count of Anjou. Anjou was a traditional rival of Normandy, so the marriage was politically sensible, but personally it was a disaster. Matilda was an empress, a proud and imperious woman of 26. Geoffrey was a 15-year-old boy. They disliked each other intensely, but they did their duty. They had 3 sons. The eldest was named Henry. This was the boy who would one day become King Henry II. When King Henry died in 1135, the succession plan fell apart. Despite their oaths, many of the English barons were not prepared to accept a woman as their ruler, and they particularly did not want to be ruled by her hated Angevin husband. While Matilda and Geoffrey were in Anjou, her cousin Stephen of Blois took his chance. Stephen was the son of Henry III's sister. He was a popular and well-liked man. He raced to England, seized the royal treasury at Winchester, and had himself crowned king in London. The church and most of the barons supported him. Matilda did not give up her claim. The result was a civil war that would tear England apart for nearly 2 decades. The period is known as the Anarchy. It was a terrible time of lawlessness and destruction, when, as one chronicler wrote, Christ and his saints slept. And the war swayed back and forth. Matilda had strong support in the west of England. Her half-brother, Robert of Gloucester, was her most important supporter and military commander. In 1139, Matilda herself landed in England to press her claim in person. Her moment of triumph came in 1141. At the Battle of Lincoln, King Stephen's army was defeated, and he was captured. Matilda had won. She marched towards London to be crowned. She took the title Lady of the English, Domina Anglorum, as a prelude to her coronation, but she snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. Her arrogant and high-handed behavior alienated the citizens of London. She refused to grant their requests for tax reductions. Before she could be crowned, she was driven out of the city by a hostile crowd. At the same time, Stephen's loyalist forces, led by his wife, Matilda of Boulogne, another formidable woman, regrouped. In a battle later that year, Matilda's commander, Robert of Gloucester, was captured. Matilda had to agree to an exchange of prisoners. Stephen was freed in exchange for Robert. The war dragged on. Matilda never again came so close to the throne. She eventually left England in 1148 and returned to Normandy, which her husband Geoffrey had now conquered. She never gave up her own claim, but she now focused her efforts on promoting the rights of her son, the young Henry. When Geoffrey of Anjou died, Henry became Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou. Then he made a brilliant marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine. He was now the most powerful ruler in France. In 1153, Henry invaded England. The country was weary of war. The barons were tired of the fighting. After some maneuvering, a treaty was agreed. The Treaty of Wallingford stated that Stephen would remain king for the rest of his life, but that Matilda's son, Henry, would be his heir. Stephen died the following year. In 1154, Henry Plantagenet peacefully ascended the throne as King Henry II, the first of the Plantagenet kings. Matilda had not won the crown for herself, but she had won it for her son. She spent the rest of her life in Normandy, acting as a trusted advisor to her son and often ruling the duchy on his behalf. She was a respected and powerful figure in European politics. She died in 1167. Her tomb inscription famously read, "Great by birth, greater by marriage, greatest in her offspring. Here lies Matilda, the daughter, wife, and mother of Henry." She was the woman who should have been queen and whose fight for the throne established the dynasty that would rule England for the next 300 years. Number 5 were Plantagenet queens, just figureheads, or financial powerhouses. A medieval queen's life was not all state dinners and ceremonial duties. Behind the scenes, a successful queen consort was the head of a large and complex business operation. The queens of the House of Plantagenet were not just wives and mothers, they were major landowners, financial patrons, and economic forces in their own right. Their financial independence gave them a significant degree of power and influence. A queen's financial security was based on her dower. This was a portion of the king's lands and revenues assigned her at the time of her marriage. It was intended to provide for her throughout her life, and especially during her widowhood. The dower lands were often extensive, scattered across the country, and included castles, manors, towns, and forests. The queen managed these lands through her own council and her own officials. She collected the rents, appointed the officials, and presided over the manorial courts. Eleanor of Castile, wife of Edward I, was a master of estate management. She wasn't just content with her initial dower lands. As we have seen, she actively and aggressively acquired more property throughout her life. She used her own officials to conduct land surveys and identify profitable new acquisitions. Her financial records show a keen eye for detail and a constant drive to increase her income. She was, in effect, the CEO of a large property corporation. This independent income was crucial. It allowed the queen to run her own household, which was a large and expensive organization. A queen's household included her ladies-in-waiting, clerks, chaplains, knights, and a vast number of domestic servants. It was the center of her social and political world. Her ability to provide jobs and positions within her household was a major source of her patronage and influence. Ambitious young men and women from noble families sought positions in the queen's household as a way to advance their careers. Another important source of a queen's income was queen's gold aurum reginae. This was a traditional levy, a surcharge of 10% on certain fines and payments made to the king. It was a right that queens had to fight to maintain, but it could be very lucrative. Eleanor of Aquitaine, for example, made extensive use of queen's gold to bolster her finances. With this wealth, queens could act as major patrons. They sponsored religious houses, founded colleges, and commissioned works of art and architecture. Philippa of Hainault was a co-founder of the Queen's College, Oxford. Margaret of Anjou founded Queen's College, Cambridge. These were not just acts of piety, they were also ways of demonstrating their status and leaving a lasting legacy. Their financial activities could also make them unpopular. Eleanor of Provence's efforts to claim every last penny of her queen's gold from the city of London contributed to her poor relationship with the Londoners. Eleanor of Castile's moneylending and land acquisition practices earned her a reputation for greed among some monastic chroniclers. When a queen became a widow, her her dower lands were her security. As a queen dowager, she was often a very wealthy and independent woman. Isabella of France, after her fall from power, lived in great comfort for decades on the income from her vast dower estates. This financial independence meant she was not reliant on the charity of her son, the king. The management of these estates required a high degree of administrative skill. Queens like Eleanor of Castile and Philippa of Hainault were known to travel extensively around their lands, conducting inspections and overseeing their officials. They were not distant landlords. They were actively involved in the business of their estates. This financial power was real power. It gave them the ability to reward their followers, to live in a style befitting their rank, to influence politics through patronage, and to act independently of their husbands when necessary. The image of the medieval queen as a powerless figurehead entirely dependent on the king is a misleading one. The Plantagenet queens were formidable economic players who understood that wealth was the foundation of influence. Number 4 was a convent, a retirement home, or a gilded cage. For many high-born women of the Plantagenet era, particularly queens and princesses who became widows, life did not end when their husband died. But their options were limited. One of the most common paths was to retire to a convent. This was not always a purely spiritual choice. For a dowager queen, entering a nunnery could be a strategic political move, a comfortable retirement, or a form of honorable imprisonment. The choice of convent was important. These were not just any nunneries. Queens and princesses typically went to wealthy and prestigious royal foundations, such as Amesbury in Wiltshire or Fontevraud in Anjou. These houses had long-standing connections with the royal family. They were major landowners and powerful institutions in their own right. For a queen dowager, retiring to a convent offered several advantages. It was a respectable and pious way to live out her widowhood. It provided a safe and secure environment away from the political turmoil of the court. It also solved the problem of her remarriage. A powerful and wealthy widow was a tempting prize, and her marriage to a new husband could destabilize the political landscape. By taking religious vows, or simply living within the convent walls, she removed herself from the marriage market. Eleanor of Provence, the widow of Henry III, retired to Amesbury. Her granddaughter Mary, a daughter of Edward I, also became a nun there. Eleanor did not become a simple nun. She lived as a great lady within the convent. She had her own apartments, her own servants, and she continued to manage her extensive dower lands from her religious retirement. She remained in close contact with her son, King Edward I, and he visited her there. For her, the convent was a dignified and comfortable way to spend her final years, combining piety with the continued status of a queen dowager. Fontevraud Abbey in France was the favored choice for the early Plantagenets. It was a unique institution because it was a double monastery housing both monks and nuns, but it was ruled by an abbess. Eleanor of Aquitaine retired there in her old age and was buried there, alongside her husband Henry II and her son Richard the Lionheart. Isabella of Angoulême, the widow of King John, also died and was buried at Fontevraud. For them, it was a spiritual home and the final resting place of their dynasty. But a convent could also be a gilded cage. It was a convenient way for a new king to neutralize a potentially troublesome female relative. After Henry II defeated Richard III and married Elizabeth of York, he had to decide what to do with his mother-in-law, the former Queen Elizabeth Woodville. In 1487, she retired to Bermondsey Abbey. The official reason was that she wished to live a religious life. But the timing was suspicious. It came just after the rebellion of Lambert Simnel, a pretender who claimed to be one of her lost sons. Many historians believe that Henry VII may have suspected her of involvement in the plot and forced her into retirement to keep her out of politics. Her lands and income were taken over by the king. For Elizabeth Woodville, the abbey was less a retreat and more a political prison. For younger princesses who were not destined for a political marriage, the convent was often their only career path. Many of the daughters of Plantagenet kings who did not marry foreign princes were placed in convents as children. This was seen as an honorable life for them, but it was not a life they chose for themselves. Life inside the convent for a royal lady was far from austere. They were not expected to live the life of an ordinary nun. They brought their own possessions, had private chambers, and were allowed to receive visitors. They were valuable assets to the convent, bringing with them royal prestige and patronage. So was it a retirement home or a prison? The answer depended on the woman and her circumstances. For a respected and powerful dowager like Eleanor of Provence, it was a choice that allowed her to maintain her dignity and status. For a politically suspect figure like Elizabeth Woodville, it was a way for the ruling power to keep her under control. The convent walls could mean peace and security, or they could mean the end of a political life. Number 3 were royal daughters, assets, or individuals. The daughters of the Plantagenet kings were born into a world of immense privilege, but they had very little control over their own lives. From the moment they were born, they were valuable assets in the great game of international diplomacy. Their marriages were not matters of the heart, they were tools of statecraft, designed to forge alliances, secure borders, and bring peace. A Plantagenet princess was a commodity on the European marriage market. The process began when they were infants. Negotiations for a potential marriage could start when a princess was still in her cradle. These negotiations were complex and lengthy, involving discussions of dowries, territories, and political commitments. The girls themselves had no say in the matter. Joan of Acre, a daughter of Edward I, is a good example. She was born in the Holy Land while her parents were on crusade. As a child, she was betrothed to a German prince. She was sent to live in Germany to be raised in her future husband's court, but the prince died before the marriage could take place. So Joan was brought back to England, ready to be offered to another potential suitor. Her father, Edward I, then arranged for her to marry the powerful Earl of Gloucester, one of his most important subjects. It was a good political match within England. Joan, however, had a mind of her own. After the Earl of Gloucester died, she fell in love with one of her late husband's squires, a man of no rank named Ralph de Monthermer. She married him in secret without her father's permission. When King Edward found out, he was furious. He had been planning another great political marriage for her. He imprisoned her new husband and confiscated all of Joan's lands. It was only after Joan pleaded with her father, reportedly saying that just as it was not shameful for a great earl to marry a poor woman, it was not shameful for a countess to marry a poor but honest man, that he relented. He eventually accepted the marriage, but it was a rare case of a princess successfully defying her father's plans. More often, the princesses did their duty. Eleanor of England, daughter of Henry II, was married to the King of Castile. Joan, another of Henry's daughters, was married to the King of Sicily and later to the Count of Toulouse. Isabella, a daughter of King John, was married to the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II. These marriages created a web of alliances that stretched across Europe. Life for these princesses in a foreign court could be difficult. They were often sent to their new homes at a very young age. They had to learn a new language and new customs. They were surrounded by strangers. Their primary duty was to produce an heir, and if they failed, their position could be precarious. Some adapted well and became powerful and influential queens in their new countries. Eleanor of Castile, who married Edward I, came to England and became a highly successful queen. But for others, it was a lonely and unhappy existence. The value of these daughters was not just in their marriages. Even if they remained unmarried, they could be used as diplomatic bargaining chips. For years, a potential marriage for one of Edward III's daughters was part of the ongoing negotiations with France and Flanders. The daughters who did not marry or who were widowed and returned to England often faced an uncertain future. Some, like Joan of Acre, took matters into their own hands. Others retired to convents. The lives of these Plantagenet princesses show the limited choices available to even the most high-born women of the period. They were instruments of their fathers' and brothers' foreign policy. Their personal happiness was a secondary consideration if it was considered at all. They were born to be pawns in a political game, and their worth was measured by the quality of the alliance their marriage could secure. Number 2, did England's queens even speak English? For the first 300 years of Plantagenet rule, if you walked into the royal court of England, you would have heard very little English being spoken. The language of the king, the queen, and the entire aristocracy was French. The queens of England, from Eleanor of Aquitaine in the 12th century to Catherine of Valois in the 15th, were native French speakers, where English was the language of the common people, not the language of power. This linguistic divide had its roots in the Norman conquest of 1066. William the Conqueror and his followers were French-speaking Normans. They established a new ruling class that imposed its language and culture on England. For centuries, French was the language of government, law, and high society. Latin was the language of the church and of official records. English was spoken by the vast majority of the population, but it was considered a low-status, peasant language. The Plantagenet dynasty, which began with Henry II in 1154, was French in origin and culture. Henry II was the Count of Anjou and Duke of Normandy. He spent more of his reign in his French territories than he did in England. His wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was the Duchess of a vast French region. French was their native tongue. It was the language they spoke to each other and to their children. This pattern continued for generations. The Plantagenet kings married princesses from France, Provence, Castile, Navarre, and Hainault. These women all came from French-speaking courts. When Eleanor of Provence arrived to marry Henry III, she brought a court full of French-speaking Savoyards. When Isabella of France married Edward II, she would have found a court that spoke her language. There is very little evidence that any of the early Plantagenet queens learned to speak English. There was no real need for them to do so. Everyone who mattered at court spoke French. They could govern, manage their households, and communicate with their husbands and the nobility entirely in French. This began to change slowly over time. During the 13th and 14th centuries, the English language started to regain its status. The constant wars with France helped to create a stronger sense of English national identity. The nobility, which had once seen itself as Anglo-Norman, began to see itself as English. They started to speak English more frequently. By the reign of Edward III in the mid-14th century, English was becoming more common at court. Edward III himself was the first king since the conquest to address Parliament in English. His wife, Philippa of Hainault, came from a French-speaking region, but she spent over 40 years in England. It is likely that she learned some English, though French would have remained her primary language. The first queen who was definitely a native English speaker was Elizabeth Woodville, who married Edward IV in 1464. She was an English woman, not a foreign princess. Her marriage marked a significant cultural shift, but even after English became more common, French retained its prestige as a language of international diplomacy and high culture. The last Plantagenet and Tudor monarchs were often bilingual or multilingual. The linguistic situation of the Plantagenet court highlights the cultural gap that existed between the rulers and the ruled for much of the Middle Ages. The queens of England were part of an international, French-speaking aristocratic culture. For them, England was a kingdom to be ruled, but its native language was not their own. They were, in a very real sense, foreigners in their own land. Number one, who were the daughters left behind by history? We remember the great Plantagenet queens Eleanor of Aquitaine, Isabella of France, Philippa of Hainault. We remember the princesses who became the mothers of kings, like Empress Matilda. But the Plantagenet family tree is full of women whose stories are less well known. These are the daughters who were not destined to be queens, the sisters and aunts of kings, whose lives were spent in the shadow of their more famous relatives. They were the forgotten princesses. Take, for example, the daughters of Edward I and Eleanor of Castile. They had a large family with at least 5 daughters who survived to adulthood. Their eldest daughter, Eleanor, was married to the Count of Bar. Another, Margaret, married the Duke of Brabant. These were typical diplomatic marriages, but 2 of their other daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, had very different lives. Mary of Woodstock was placed in Amesbury Priory as a child by her parents. She became a nun, but as the king's daughter, she lived a life of privilege within the convent. Well, she had her own household, traveled extensively, and was involved in the management of the priory's estates. She lived a long life, a powerful and respected religious figure, but one largely absent from the main political narrative of her brother Edward II's reign. Her younger sister, Elizabeth of Rhuddlan, had a more turbulent life. She was married first to a Dutch count. After he died, she returned to England and married the Earl of Hereford. Her Her second husband was one of the leading opponents of her brother, Edward II. This placed her in a difficult position, caught between her loyalty to her husband and her loyalty to her brother. Her husband was eventually executed for his rebellion against the king. Elizabeth was a princess caught in the crossfire of civil strife. Then there are the daughters of Edward III and Philippa of Hainault. Their sons are famous: the Black Prince, John of Gaunt, Lionel of Clarence. But they also had daughters. Isabella of England was their eldest daughter. She was beautiful and her father's favorite. For years, her marriage was a key bargaining chip in European politics. She was betrothed several times, but the arrangements always fell through. Finally, in her 30s, which was very late for a royal bride, she fell in love with a French nobleman, Enguerrand de Coucy. Her father agreed to the match. For a time, she lived a happy life, but the endless wars between England and France eventually forced her husband to choose France. Isabella returned to England, separated from the man she loved by the conflict between their two countries. The most tragic story might be that of Bridget of York. She was the youngest daughter of King Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville. She was born in 1480. While her older sisters, like Elizabeth of York, were destined for great marriages, Bridget was destined for the church from a young age. She was placed in the nunnery at Dartford when she was a child. She lived through the fall of her house, the rise of the Tudors, and the reigns of her brother-in-law and her nephew, Henry VIII. She lived a quiet, secluded life as a nun, far from the dramatic events that engulfed her family. She died around 1517, a Plantagenet princess who had become a forgotten Tudor nun. These women's lives reveal a different side of the Plantagenet story. They show the limited options available even to princesses. Their fates were dictated by the needs of their fathers and brothers. They could be married off for an alliance, used as a bargaining chip, or placed in a convent to live a life of prayer. Their personal desires were rarely considered. While some, like Joan of Acre, fought for their own choices, most accepted the path laid out for them. They are the supporting cast in the grand drama of the Plantagenet dynasty, but their stories are a crucial part of the fabric of the age.